The ballroom blazed with 1,000 candles, their light glittering off gilt-edged mirrors and the jewels adorning London's finest. Yet the brilliance did nothing to warm the bitter cold of February 1847, nor could it dispel the chill that had settled around Lady Beatrice Ashford like a shroud these past 18 months. She stood near the periphery of the gathering, positioned neither fully within the crowd nor entirely apart from it, that careful, uncomfortable space occupied by those whose reputations have been tarnished just enough to inspire whispers, but not so thoroughly destroyed as to warrant complete ostracism. At 26, she was no longer young by society's merciless measure, and the scandal that clung to her, her refusal of no fewer than 4 perfectly acceptable suitors, her unfortunate habit of expressing opinions at intellectual gatherings where ladies were expected to ornament rather than participate, and most damningly, the vicious rumors spread by Lord Pemberton after she'd rejected his advances had rendered her something worse than pitied. She had become invisible, a cautionary tale, mothers referenced in hushed tones, a woman whose independence had purchased her nothing but loneliness. She watched the dancers spin past in their elaborate waltzes, their faces bright with wine and possibility, and felt the familiar weight of resignation settling deeper into her bones. The understanding that this half-life of social purgatory was likely all that remained to her now. It was in this moment of profound isolation that her aunt appeared at her elbow, expression carefully neutral, voice pitched low beneath the swell of the orchestra. "Beatrice, my dear, there has been an inquiry," her aunt said, and something in those words, their formality, their careful lack of enthusiasm, made Beatrice's breath catch. "The Viscount Hartwell has expressed interest in making your acquaintance. His father is unwell, you understand, and there are certain expectations regarding his establishment of a household." The meaning was perfectly clear. This was not a romantic overture but a transaction, a desperate measure to satisfy a dying man's wishes and silence the gossip that had begun to swirl around the Viscount's own prolonged bachelorhood and increasingly hermetic existence at his country estate. Beatrice had heard the stories. Edmund Hartwell, 32 years old, wealthy beyond measure, devastatingly handsome in that severe, unapproachable way, and entirely closed off, since a broken engagement years prior had left him cold and cynical where matters of the heart were concerned. He needed a wife for appearance's sake. She needed escape from the suffocating prison of her ruined reputation. When they were introduced an hour later in a quiet alcove, away from the ballroom's chaos, their meeting held all the warmth of a business negotiation between solicitors, his bow correct and remote, her curtsy perfect and empty, their eyes meeting for only the briefest moment before both looked away, as if even that small connection was too much intimacy to bear, and in that moment of careful, mutual avoidance, the terms of their future were wordlessly established. This would be an arrangement, nothing more, a marriage of convenience that would provide each what they needed while demanding nothing so dangerous, so terrifying, as genuine feeling. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Now, let's begin. The wedding took place on a grey autumn morning when the sky hung low and heavy over London, threatening rain that never quite fell, as if even the heavens could not be bothered to offer either blessing or protest to the union being solemnized within the cold stone walls of St. George's Chapel. Beatrice stood in her ivory gown borrowed from her cousin, as there had seemed little point in commissioning something elaborate for a marriage that was, at its heart, a business arrangement, and felt the weight of resignation settle around her shoulders like a cloak she would wear for the rest of her days. Yet beneath that resignation, buried so deep she barely dared acknowledge it even to herself, lived a small, stubborn seed of hope. Perhaps companionship might grow between them. Perhaps kindness might flourish where passion was not expected. Perhaps this cold beginning might slowly, gradually warm into something bearable, if not beautiful. She glanced at Edmund as they stood before the Archbishop, his profile severe and remote, his jaw tight with what she interpreted as determination. She understood with a pang of something that might have been grief, to feel nothing, to keep whatever remained of his heart locked safely away where it could not be touched, could not be hurt again. He spoke his vows in a voice devoid of inflection, a recitation of words required by law and custom, and when he placed the ring upon her finger, His touch was brief and impersonal, gone almost before she registered its presence. She made her own promises in a voice that threatened to break but held, barely, and when the Archbishop pronounced them man and wife, Edmund's kiss to her cheek was so fleeting, so careful in its avoidance of intimacy, that it felt more like a formality observed than a marriage sealed. The wedding breakfast that followed was a stilted affair of forced smiles and careful conversation, their families visibly relieved to have the matter settled. Edmund's father, too ill to attend the ceremony, had sent his blessing from his sickbed, satisfied that his son had finally done his duty. Beatrice's aunt radiated the particular satisfaction of one who has successfully disposed of a difficult problem and society. That insatiable beast, always hungry for fresh gossip, found itself satisfied that the reclusive Viscount and the scandal-tainted lady had solved each other's problems in one efficient stroke. When at last they departed for Hartwell Manor, the carriage rolled through the countryside in profound silence. Beatrice watching the landscape transform from London's grey streets to rolling hills painted in autumn's rust and gold, Edmund staring fixedly out the opposite window, as if she did not exist beside him, and with each mile that passed, she felt the distance between them solidify into something nearly tangible. The manor, when it finally appeared through the gathering dusk, and was breathtaking in its beauty, a grand edifice of honey-coloured stone, with mullioned windows that caught the last rays of dying sunlight. Yet there was something cold about it, something unwelcoming in its perfection, as if it had been built to impress rather than to shelter, to showcase rather than to embrace, much like the marriage she had just entered. They were greeted by an efficient staff who bowed and curtsied with practiced precision, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Phillips, showed Beatrice to her chambers, lovely rooms decorated in pale blue and cream, with windows overlooking the gardens, and notably, pointedly, separated from the master's chambers by the entire length of a corridor. While Edmund disappeared into his study without a word beyond the formal pleasantries required by basic courtesy, that night Beatrice stood alone in her beautiful cold room, still wearing the borrowed gown, and understood with perfect clarity that she had traded one form of loneliness for another, and as she finally undressed and climbed into the large, empty bed, she told herself that this was what she had agreed to. This was the bargain she had made, and she had no right to the tears that slipped silently down her cheeks in the darkness. Weeks passed in a careful choreography of avoidance, a dance of two people sharing a house but never quite sharing a life, their routines established with the precision of clockwork and all the warmth of the mechanism's cold gears. Edmund rose before dawn each morning, breaking his fast alone in his study while reviewing the estate ledgers, and by the time Beatrice descended for breakfast, he had already gone out to inspect the fields, to meet with tenants, to ride the borders of his property, as if cataloguing every fence post and hedgerow might fill the emptiness that had taken up residence in his chest since he'd vowed never to feel again. She spent her mornings exploring the manor room by room, discovering the history contained within its walls, and it was during one such exploration that she found the library, a magnificent two-story room with floor-to-ceiling shelves and tall windows that should have filled the space with light, but instead only illuminated the thick dust coating every surface, the neglect that had transformed what must once have been the heart of the house into something like a mausoleum for forgotten words. The books were in complete disarray, stacked haphazardly or fallen to their sides, years of accumulated disorder that spoke of abandonment, and Beatrice found herself drawn to the project of restoration, not because anyone asked her to, not because it was expected, but because tending to these neglected volumes gave her purpose in a house where she otherwise existed, like a ghost, present but insubstantial, seen but not acknowledged. She worked steadily through the afternoons, organizing volumes by subject and author, cleaning leather bindings with careful hands, and lost herself in the physical labor of creating order from chaos, finding in the work a meditation that quieted the loneliness, threatening to consume her. Their only required interaction came at dinner, that nightly ritual of excruciating formality where they sat at opposite ends of a table designed to seat 20, served course after course by servants whose careful expressions revealed nothing of what they must think of this strange, silent marriage. Edmund spoke only when politeness demanded it, inquiries about her health, observations about the weather, and Beatrice responded in kind, both of them performing courtesy like actors in a play neither had auditioned for and between the stilted pleasantries stretched vast silences, filled only with the clink of silver against porcelain and the measured tread of servants' feet. Yet despite their mutual determination to maintain distance, Beatrice found herself watching him when she thought he wouldn't notice, observing him from library windows as he walked the grounds each evening after dinner, always alone, his hands clasped behind his back, and his head bowed as if carrying the weight of thoughts too heavy to share, and she began to see beyond the cold facade he presented to the sadness in his eyes, the particular loneliness of someone who had chosen isolation not because he preferred solitude, but because connection had proven too painful to risk. She noticed, too, his interactions with the estate workers, the patience with which he listened to their concerns, the fairness of his decisions, the respect his tenants showed him that spoke of genuine regard rather than mere obligation. And she understood that the wall he'd built around his heart had not destroyed his capacity for kindness, only locked it away where it could not be weaponized against him. What she did not know, could not see, was that Edmund had begun noticing her as well, the gentleness with which she spoke to even the lowest scullery maid, treating each servant as a person worthy of consideration rather than invisible hands, performing necessary tasks. The quiet grace with which she moved through his house, bringing a softness to rooms that had known only masculine austerity for years, but he said nothing, allowed no flicker of awareness to cross his carefully controlled features, and told himself that noticing was not the same as caring, that observation required no vulnerability, and that he could live indefinitely in this half-existence they had created, never acknowledging that with each passing day, the distance between them felt less like safety and more like a prison of his own construction. A month after the wedding, when November's chill had settled permanently into the stones of Hartwell Manor and the last stubborn leaves had finally surrendered to winter's approach, Beatrice woke one morning with a scratching sensation in her throat and a heaviness in her chest that she initially dismissed as nothing more than the result of working in the dusty library without adequate ventilation. By afternoon, however, the minor irritation had blossomed into a persistent cough that left her breathless, and by the time dinner arrived, that nightly ritual of careful distance, she found herself struggling to maintain her composure through each course, her throat raw and her head beginning to ache with a dull, insistent pressure. Edmund noticed, of course, though his face betrayed nothing beyond a slight tightening around his eyes, and when she excused herself early, offering apologies that came out rougher than intended, he merely inclined his head in acknowledgement and watched her retreat with an expression Mrs. Phillips, clearing the plates, could not quite decipher. That evening, maintaining the careful propriety that governed every aspect of their separate lives, Edmund sent the housekeeper to check on the new Viscountess, instructing her to ensure Beatrice had everything she required and to summon the doctor if her condition worsened, and Mrs. Phillips returned with the report that her ladyship was resting comfortably and had requested only some hot water with honey and lemon, which was promptly delivered. Edmund retired to his study as usual, attempting to focus on correspondence that suddenly seemed utterly meaningless, and told himself that his concern was merely the responsibility any husband would feel for a wife's well-being, nothing more personal than duty required. Yet as the hour grew late and the house settled into nighttime silence, he found himself climbing the stairs and walking down the corridor that led to her chambers, telling himself he was simply passing by on his way to his own rooms, despite the fact that this route was entirely out of his way. He stood outside her door in the darkened hallway, his hand raised to knock but frozen in indecision, and heard through the heavy wood the sound of her coughing, harsh, painful spasms that seemed to go on, and something in his chest constricted with an intensity that alarmed him, but he did not knock, he did not enter, merely stood like a sentry in the shadows until the coughing subsided and silence returned, and then he retreated to his own cold bed, where he lay awake far longer than he wished to examine. The next morning, he rose even earlier than usual and went directly to the kitchen, where he surprised the cook by instructing her personally to prepare a specific tea chamomile with honey and a touch of brandy, the exact preparation he had noticed Beatrice taking at dinner several weeks prior, when she had mentioned, in one of their few actual exchanges, that her mother had always sworn by the combination for throat complaints, and he ordered it sent to her chambers with breakfast. When Beatrice received the tray and saw not just the standard breakfast tea but this particular preparation, made exactly as she preferred it, she sat very still in her bed for a long moment, the cup warming her hands, and understood with sudden clarity that Edmund had been paying attention, that despite the distance he maintained and the walls he had built so carefully around himself, he had noticed this small detail about her preferences and remembered it. She found him that afternoon in his study, having ventured downstairs despite Mrs. Phillips's gentle protests that she should rest, and when she thanked him for the tea, for his thoughtfulness in remembering such a small thing, he looked up from his ledgers with an expression that might have been surprise or might have been something more vulnerable, quickly shuttered away, and he said simply, "It was nothing." But she saw the way his fingers tightened on his pen, saw something flicker in his eyes, perhaps astonishment that she had recognized the gesture for what it was, perhaps discomfort at being seen, at having his carefully maintained facade of indifference cracked by an act of kindness he had not quite been able to suppress. And though he returned his attention to his work in clear dismissal, and though she retreated without pressing further, something had shifted between them. Some small seed had been planted in the frozen ground of their arrangement, and neither of them could quite pretend otherwise. The library had become Beatrice's sanctuary in the weeks following her recovery from the cold, a place where she could lose herself in the quiet work of restoration, while the November rains fell steadily against the tall windows, and she had developed a comfortable routine of spending her evenings there after dinner, organizing volumes by the warm light of oil lamps, while Edmund presumably retreated to his study or his chambers, as he always did, maintaining the distance that had become the defining characteristic of their marriage, despite that one small crack of kindness he had shown. But one evening, perhaps a week after the incident with the tea, she looked up from a stack of botanical texts she was cataloguing to find him standing in the doorway, his expression uncertain in a way she had never seen before, as though he had wandered into a room he was no longer certain he had the right to enter. And when she met his eyes, he seemed on the verge of retreating until she said simply, "Good evening," with no question in her voice, no demand for explanation, just acknowledgement of his presence. He entered slowly, his gaze moving across the shelves she had spent weeks cleaning and organizing, taking in the transformation she had wrought in this neglected space, and after a long moment of silence he said, his voice rougher than usual, "This was my mother's project. You know the library. She spent years collecting these books, organizing them just so. After she died, when I was 12, my father locked the doors. I don't think he could bear to see what she had loved. It was the first truly personal thing he had shared with her, the first glimpse beneath the armor of formality he wore like a second skin, and Beatrice felt something shift in her chest, an understanding that this moment required careful handling, that he had offered something fragile, and any wrong move might send him retreating back behind his walls forever. She said gently, "She had exquisite taste. The collection is remarkable: philosophy, poetry, natural history, all the great works. She must have been a woman of considerable intellect." He nodded, running his fingers along a shelf she had recently polished. "She was. My father never appreciated that about her. He thought books were frivolous for a woman of her station. They spoke for only a few minutes more, tentative words about literature and loss, about the comfort found in the company of books, when human company proved too complicated or too painful, and then he withdrew, offering a formal good evening that might have seemed like a return to distance, except that 2 nights later he appeared in the doorway again, and this time he brought a book of his own and settled into the leather chair across from where she worked, reading in silence while she continued her cataloguing, and gradually, without discussion or acknowledgement, it became a pattern. Some evenings he came and some he did not, but when he did, they existed in a parallel silence that was nothing like the painful quiet of their dinner table, a shared space that asked nothing and offered everything. And though they rarely spoke beyond brief exchanges about a particular volume or author, Beatrice began to feel that perhaps Edmund Hartwell was not entirely unreachable after all, and that somewhere beneath his carefully maintained ice was a man who had once known how to connect, who had loved his mother enough to lock away her memory rather than face the pain of it, who was capable of warmth, even if he had forgotten how to let it reach the surface, and she found herself looking forward to those library evenings with an intensity that should have alarmed her, but instead felt like the first truly honest emotion she had allowed herself since entering into this arrangement that was supposed to protect them both from feeling anything at all. As autumn deepened toward winter and November gave way to December, The transformation between them was so gradual, so carefully unacknowledged, that neither could have pointed to a single moment when their arrangement shifted into something else, something neither had dared to name or claim, yet it was there in the accumulation of small gestures that spoke louder than any words they had not found. The courage to utter the evening when Beatrice, reaching for a volume on a high shelf in the library, he found Edmund suddenly beside her, his hand steadying her elbow as he retrieved the book himself, their fingers brushing in the transfer, and the contact lasted perhaps a heartbeat longer than necessity required, neither of them pulling away immediately, both acutely aware of the warmth of skin against skin, before propriety reasserted itself, and they stepped apart with murmured thanks that could not quite mask the electricity of that brief touch. She began leaving the brandy decanter filled in the library on the evenings when he joined her, having noticed that he preferred a particular variety from the cellars, and though he never mentioned it directly, she saw him pause the first time he found it waiting, saw something soften in his expression before he poured himself a glass and settled into his customary chair, and the next evening she found her favorite shawl, which she had mentioned once in passing made the library comfortable on cold nights, draped across the back of her usual seat, and they both pretended not to notice these small acts of consideration that revealed how carefully they observed each other despite the distance they ostensibly maintained. At dinner, that nightly ritual that had once been an endurance of painful silence, their eyes met across the table with increasing frequency, glances that lingered a moment longer than politeness dictated, conversations that, while still formal, had begun to include actual exchanges rather than mere pleasantries, and once, when she made a wry observation about the absurdity of a letter she had received from a former acquaintance in London, she saw his mouth quirk in what might have been the ghost of a smile, quickly suppressed but unmistakably there, and the sight of it made her heart perform an uncomfortable acrobatic feat in her chest that she refused to examine too closely. The household staff noticed, of course, for servants always see what their employers imagine hidden, and Mrs. Phillips remarked to the housekeeper that his lordship seemed less severe of late, while the housekeeper observed that her ladyship had begun wearing her hair in a softer style, and had asked for the rose silk dress to be pressed for dinner rather than her usual subdued greys, and they exchanged knowing looks that suggested they understood what the Viscount and Viscountess themselves would not yet admit, that somewhere in the careful space between them, something was growing, something that frightened them both because it required exactly the vulnerability they had each sworn to avoid when they entered this arrangement, meant to protect them from feeling anything dangerous or real. Neither spoke of these changes aloud, as if words might shatter whatever fragile thing was building between them, both trapped in fear that the other did not feel the same, that any acknowledgement would reveal they had misread kindness for something deeper, ordinary courtesy for affection, and so they continued their careful dance of proximity and restraint, wanting and not daring to want, until one morning in mid-December when Beatrice woke to find the world beyond her window transformed, the first snow of winter having fallen in the night, covering the estate in a blanket of white that muffled all sound and made everything clean and new and full of possibility, and when she came down to breakfast, she found Edmund standing at the window, looking out at the changed landscape, with an expression she had never seen before, something almost peaceful, almost hopeful, and when he turned and saw her there, he did not immediately shutter that expression away, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the morning room while the snow fell silently outside, and everything that had been carefully unspoken hung between them like a promise. Neither was quite ready to make but could longer entirely deny. Christmas arrived at Hartwell Manor with a transformation that no one who had known the estate in recent years could have anticipated. For Beatrice, drawing upon reserves of courage she had not known she possessed, they had quietly organized celebrations for the household staff and tenant families, modest gatherings that brought the scent of pine boughs and mulled wine into rooms that had not seen such festivity in more than a decade, and Edmund, watching from doorways and corners as his wife moved through the manor, bringing warmth and laughter to spaces that had been cold and silent for so long, felt something crack open in his chest that he had thought permanently sealed, a painful expansion of feeling that was equal parts gratitude and something far more dangerous, something that whispered that this woman he had married out of obligation and convenience had become essential to him in ways he had sworn never to allow anyone to become essential again. The tenants who came to receive small gifts and seasonal wishes remarked to one another that her ladyship had brought life back to the manor, that his lordship seemed almost human when he stood beside her, and the household staff, preparing the traditional Christmas dinner, worked with a lightness that came from serving in a home that finally felt like something more than a beautiful mausoleum. On Christmas evening, after the celebrations had concluded and the guests had departed into the crystalline winter night, Beatrice and Edmund found themselves alone in the drawing room, the fire burning low, candles flickering on the mantelpiece beside arrangements of holly and ivy, and the silence between them was different from the silences they had endured in those early weeks of marriage. This was a companionable quiet, comfortable and warm, until Beatrice rose and retrieved a small package wrapped in brown paper and ribbon, her hands trembling slightly as she offered it to him with a simple, "I hope you don't think it presumptuous. I saw it and thought of you." Edmund took the package with an expression of such genuine surprise that she realized, with a pang of sadness, that he had not expected to be thought of at all, had not anticipated that anyone would consider his preferences or pleasures worth the effort of attention. And when he unwrapped the paper to reveal a volume of poetry he had been reading repeatedly in the library, now rebound in supple new leather with his initials tooled in gold on the spine, she watched his face transform, watched him run his fingers over the binding with a reverence that told her he understood this was not merely a gift, but a declaration that she had been paying attention, that she had noticed what brought him solace, that he mattered to her in ways that went far beyond the terms of their arrangement. He looked up at her with eyes that were suspiciously bright and said, his voice rough, "Beatrice, I have nothing for you. I didn't think." And the visible regret in his expression, the self-recrimination, moved her more than any prepared speech could have, and she assured him quickly that it didn't matter, that she had not given the gift with any expectation of reciprocation, but he was already standing, already moving toward the door with sudden purpose, and she remained by the fire, uncertain and hoping, until he returned several minutes later, carrying a small wooden box that looked old and precious, and when he opened it to reveal a strand of luminous pearls, perfectly matched and glowing in the candlelight, she drew in a sharp breath of recognition, because even she, who had been in the manor only a few months, had heard the servants speak in whispers of the late Viscountess's pearl necklace, the only piece of his mother's jewelry that Edmund had kept when the rest was divided among relatives after her death. He lifted the pearls from their velvet bed with hands that were not entirely steady and said, "She would have wanted you to have it. She would have," and his voice broke, and he had to pause, had to gather himself before he could continue. She would have loved that someone was bringing warmth back to this house, that someone was making it a home again. And when Beatrice turned to allow him to fasten the clasp at her nape, when she felt his fingers brush against her skin and linger there just a moment longer than necessary, when she turned back to face him and saw in his eyes something raw and unguarded and terrifyingly vulnerable, she understood that something fundamental had shifted between them, that they had crossed some invisible threshold from which there could be no retreat back into the safe distance of their arrangement, and neither of them spoke of it. Neither dared to name what hung in the air between them, like the scent of pine and promise. But when she whispered, "Thank you, Edmund. I shall treasure it always," and he replied, "As I shall treasure this," holding the rebound book against his chest as though it were something sacred, they both knew that they were no longer speaking only of gifts exchanged at Christmas, but of something infinitely more precious and infinitely more frightening that neither was quite ready to claim but could no longer deny. January arrived with bitter cold that turned the windows of Hartwell Manor into canvases of frost and ice, the kind of penetrating chill that made even the heartiest fires seem inadequate. Yet between Edmund and Beatrice there grew a warmth that had nothing to do with the hearths that blazed in every room, and everything to do with the way they had begun, almost without realizing it, to lower the final defenses they had maintained even through the tentative intimacy of the library evenings and the revelatory exchange of Christmas gifts. And when a storm descended in the second week of the month, bringing snow so thick and wind so fierce that the estate was rendered utterly isolated from the village and the world beyond, they found themselves snowed in together with nothing to separate them from honesty except the fear they had both carried for so long. That evening, as the wind howled against the manor walls and the library fire crackled with unusual intensity, they sat closer than they ever had before, sharing the brandy that had become their ritual, and perhaps it was the isolation, the sense that the world had narrowed to just the two of them and this room, or perhaps it was simply that the pretense had become more exhausting than the truth. But when Beatrice spoke, her voice was quieter than usual, almost hesitant, and she said something she had never intended to share with anyone, least of all with this man she had married. As a matter of convenience, she spoke of her loneliness in London, the years of watching herself become invisible as the scandal attached itself to her name. And then, with a courage that made her hands tremble around her glass, she told him what had truly happened, that a gentleman she had refused, a man of charm and cruelty, had spread lies when his pride could not bear her rejection, had whispered to society that she had encouraged him and then spurned him capriciously, and though the lies were vague enough to avoid outright accusation, they were specific enough to taint her, to make her someone respectable families would not risk association with, and she confessed that she had begun to fear she would remain forever unseen, forever defined by falsehoods, forever alone. Edmund listened with an expression that shifted from attention to anger on her behalf to something that looked almost like pain, and when she fell silent, when the only sounds were the fire and the storm, he spoke in turn, his voice rough with emotion he no longer tried to hide, and he told her about Catherine, the woman he had loved when he was 25 and foolish enough to believe that love was enough, how she had accepted his proposal and worn his ring and smiled at him with what he had thought was genuine affection, and how he had discovered, quite by accident, that she was simultaneously encouraging the attentions of the Duke of Ashford, a man of greater title and far greater wealth, and when the Duke offered for her, she had broken their engagement without apparent regret, had looked at Edmund with something like pity, and said that surely he understood she had to think of her future, and he had vowed in that moment never to be vulnerable again, never to offer his heart to someone who might weigh it against material advantage and find it wanting. They sat in the firelight, having laid bare their wounds and their fears, having shown each other the tender places they had hidden from the world, and though neither reached for the other, though no declarations were made and no promises spoken, they both understood that something fundamental had changed between them, that they had crossed from careful companionship into dangerous territory where real feeling lived, where hope and terror intertwined, where the possibility of hurt was matched only by the possibility of healing, and the truth that neither dared to speak aloud, but both recognized in the other's eyes, was that this marriage of convenience, this arrangement meant to protect them from feeling, had become something neither could control and neither truly wanted to resist, something that had transformed from obligation into necessity, from convenience into something that felt remarkably, terrifyingly, hopefully like love. February arrived with a tension that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the charged atmosphere that existed now in every room where Edmund and Beatrice found themselves together. For after the confessions of that snowed-in January night, they had become acutely, painfully aware of each other in ways that made ordinary interactions feel weighted with significance, and every glance carried meaning, every accidental brush of hands felt electric. Every evening in the library became an exercise in restraint that left them both exhausted and aching with feelings they had acknowledged to themselves, but not yet dared to speak aloud to each other. One particular evening, as thin February light faded beyond the windows, and the library lamps cast their golden glow across the familiar space that had become the geography of their growing intimacy, they stood together examining a newly acquired volume of romantic poetry, their shoulders nearly touching as they bent over the pages, and Beatrice was reading aloud a passage about love and longing when she became aware that Edmund had gone very still beside her, and that he was no longer looking at the book, but at her face with an intensity that made her breath catch and her words falter mid-sentence. And when she looked up to meet his gaze, she found in his eyes something so raw and undisguised that she felt her heart begin to race, felt the air between them thicken with possibility and promise, and terrible, wonderful fear. He reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away, to retreat into the safety of distance. But she remained frozen, caught between longing and terror as his hand rose toward her face, his fingers trembling slightly as they approached her cheek, and the moment stretched and expanded until it seemed to contain everything, all the months of careful distance, all the evenings of growing closeness, all the words spoken and unspoken, all the hope and fear and desperate wanting that neither had been brave enough to claim, and she could feel the warmth of his hand, though he had not yet touched her skin, could see in his expression the same paralysis of desire and doubt that held her motionless, and for one suspended breath it seemed inevitable that the distance between them would finally close. But then something shifted in his face, some shadow of old hurt or remembered betrayal, some terror that the woman before him might wound him as Catherine had wounded him, and he pulled his hand back abruptly as though burned, stepped away from her with a jerky movement that shattered the spell of the moment, and said in a voice gone stiff and formal, "Forgive me." That was, "I apologize, Lady Hartwell. I should not have." And he was gone before she could respond, leaving her standing alone in the library, with the book of poetry still open in her hands, and her heart hammering against her ribs, and her mind racing with confusion and hurt, and the terrible question of whether she had misread in everything, whether all the warmth and growing intimacy had been only her own foolish imagination, whether he did not feel for her what she had begun to believe he felt, what she had allowed herself to hope he felt. Edmund, fleeing to his own chambers like a coward, pressed his forehead against the cold glass of his window and stared out at the winter bare gardens without seeing them, furious with himself for his weakness in almost touching her, and more furious still for his cowardice in pulling away. And the truth that burned through him with merciless clarity was that he loved her with an intensity that terrified him, loved her in ways that made him vulnerable in exactly the manner he had sworn never to be vulnerable again, for he had married her precisely to avoid this kind of feeling, had chosen an arrangement over courtship specifically to protect himself from the possibility of caring too much and being hurt too deeply. And yet here he stood, undone by a woman he had tried to keep at arm's length, a woman who had somehow slipped past every defense he had constructed and made herself absolutely essential to his happiness. And the depth of his feelings for her was precisely what paralyzed him, because he could not bear the thought that she might not return them, could not survive another rejection, another moment of offering his heart and having it weighed and found insufficient. And so he had pulled away, had retreated into coldness and formality, had hurt her to protect himself, and he hated himself for it even as he knew he would do it again, and could keep doing it until he found the courage to risk everything or lost her entirely to his own fear. Early March arrived with tentative promises of spring, the first crocuses pushing through the melting snow around Hartwell Manor's gardens, and with it came news from the village that several families had fallen ill with fever, the kind of sickness that spread through households like wildfire and left grief in its wake. And when Beatrice learned that the Marston family tenant farmers, with 4 young children, had all taken ill, and that Mrs. Marston was too weak to care for her little ones, she insisted on going to them despite the housekeeper's worried protests and Edmund's visible tension when she announced her intention at breakfast, though he said nothing to stop her, only watched her with an expression that might have been concern or might have been the lingering awkwardness that had persisted between them since that terrible moment in the library when he had almost touched her face and then fled. She went with baskets of food and medicine, with clean linens and a determination to be useful, and though she took precautions keeping her distance when possible, washing her hands with the thoroughness the doctor had recommended, there was only so much care one could take when helping to feed sick children and comfort a frightened mother. And when she returned to the manor that evening, she felt satisfied with the good she had done and thought nothing of the faint headache that had begun to press behind her eyes, dismissing it as simple fatigue from a long day of work that had been more physically demanding than her usual routines of library restoration and correspondence. The next day she returned to the Marstons, and the day after that, and by the 3rd day she noticed that her fatigue had deepened into something more troubling, a heaviness in her limbs that made even simple movements feel effortful. But she attributed it to poor sleep and continued with her routine, taking tea with Edmund in strained near silence that broke her heart a little more each day, the easy intimacy they had built over the winter now replaced with careful politeness that felt like a death of its own kind, and she found herself wondering if she had lost him entirely, if his moment of near tenderness had frightened him so thoroughly that he would retreat forever behind his walls of propriety and coldness. But by evening her headache had become severe enough that she excused herself from dinner, and when she stood from her chair in the drawing-room, the world tilted alarmingly, and she had to grip the back of the furniture to steady herself, and Edmund was on his feet immediately, asking if she was well, and she assured him it was nothing, just tiredness, just a headache, and she made her way toward her chambers with what dignity she could muster, even as her vision began to blur at the edges and her skin began to burn with a heat that had nothing to do with the fires blazing in the hearths. She reached the hallway outside her room before her legs gave way entirely, and the last thing she remembered with clarity was the floor rising up to meet her, and the sound of her own body striking the carpet, and then the housekeeper's scream and the thunder of footsteps and Edmund's voice cutting through the gathering darkness with a panic she had never heard from him before, shouting for help, shouting her name, and then his hands on her face and the world disappeared into fever and flame. When Edmund was summoned from the stables where he had gone to escape the torment of being near Beatrice while maintaining the careful distance his cowardice demanded, when he was told that Lady Hartwell had collapsed, something fundamental shattered in his chest, and he ran through the manor with his heart in his throat, taking stairs 3 at a time, and when he reached her and saw her crumpled in the hallway, unconscious, her skin flushed with fever, every careful wall he had constructed, every protection he had maintained, every defense against feeling too much simply ceased to exist, and he gathered her into his arms with shaking hands and carried her to her room, calling for the doctor with a voice that came out raw and commanding and barely controlled, and the household staff moved with urgent efficiency because they had never, not once in all the years of his lordship's residence at the manor, heard such emotion in his voice or seen such fear in his eyes, and they understood as they sent riders racing toward the village that something had changed, that whatever careful arrangement had existed between the Viscount and his wife had transformed into something that made his hands tremble as he laid her on the bed and refused to leave her side, even to let the maids tend to her, and when the doctor finally arrived and examined her with grave efficiency and pronounced it the same fever that had struck the village, the same illness that had already claimed 2 lives that week, Edmund's face went white as death itself, and his voice, when he asked about treatment, about prognosis, about anything that could be done, shook with barely suppressed terror, and the doctors answered that they could only keep her comfortable, only wait and hope that the fever must run its course, and some survived it, and some did not land it, like a physical blow that made Edmund grip the bedpost to remain standing. And when the doctor suggested that his lordship should perhaps keep his distance to avoid contagion, should leave her care to the servants who could nurse her in shifts, Edmund looked at him with eyes gone hard and said in a voice that allowed no argument, "I'm not leaving her," and the staff exchanged glances, heavy with worry and something that might have been hope, because they understood in that moment that their master loved his wife, loved her with a desperation that had been hiding beneath months of careful courtesy, and that the next days would test him in ways that estate management and social obligations never could, would demand from him a courage that had nothing to do with stoicism and everything to do with the terrifying vulnerability of loving someone enough to risk losing them, of caring so deeply that the possibility of grief became unbearable. And as the doctor took his leave with instructions to send for him if her condition changed, Edmund pulled a chair to Beatrice's bedside and took her burning hand in his and prepared to face the greatest fear of his carefully defended life. The doctor departed with his bag of useless remedies and his warnings about contagion that Edmund had dismissed with barely concealed contempt, and as the sound of hooves faded down the manor drive, Edmund settled into the chair he had pulled to Beatrice's bedside and understood with crystalline clarity that he would not be leaving this room and would not be observing proper distance or taking sensible precautions or protecting himself from illness, because the only unbearable thing in this moment was the thought of her suffering alone, of her waking in confusion or pain to find herself abandoned, and he took her burning hand in both of his and felt the fever radiating from her skin like heat from a forge, and thought wildly that surely his touch should cool her, surely his will should be enough to draw the sickness from her body. But she only trembled and murmured incoherently, and he reached for the basin of cool water the housekeeper had left and began the work that would occupy the long hours ahead, dampening cloths and laying them gently across her forehead, her throat, her wrists, anywhere the fever seemed to burn most fiercely. The night deepened around them, and the house fell into worried silence, the servants speaking in hushed voices beyond the door, occasionally bringing fresh water or broth that Edmund barely acknowledged, and Beatrice drifted between states of consciousness that bore little resemblance to true awareness, sometimes thrashing against the blankets he tried to keep over her, sometimes lying so still that his heart would seize with terror until he felt the shallow rise and fall of her breathing. And in the moments when her eyes opened and seemed to recognize him, she would whisper through cracked lips that he should go, that he must leave her, that he would fall ill himself if he stayed, and each time she said it, something fierce and protective rose in his chest, and he would lean closer and stroke the damp hair back from her face and say with a conviction that surprised him with its intensity, "I'm not leaving you." And it was the first time in their months of marriage that he had spoken to her with such raw, unguarded emotion, the first time he had allowed her to hear in his voice what he had been too cowardly to say in health. And though she was too fevered to fully comprehend his tone, she seemed to quiet at his words, to settle back against the pillows, as though his presence alone provided some comfort against the fire consuming her from within. As the hours crept toward dawn, Edmund found himself speaking to her in whispers, his voice hoarse and low, saying things he had never said to anyone, apologizing for the coldness of their early months together, for the distance he had maintained so carefully, for the walls he had built between them out of fear and old wounds, and he told her about the loneliness of the years before she came, the emptiness of the manor that had felt like a reflection of the emptiness in his own chest, and he confessed that she had changed everything without even trying, that her presence in his library and at his table and in his thoughts had transformed his understanding of what life might contain, that somewhere in the accumulation of quiet evenings and stolen glances he had fallen irrevocably in love with her and had been too much a coward to say so. And he spoke these truths to her unconscious form, with tears streaming unheeded down his face, because he could not bear the thought that she might die without knowing that she had been loved, that she was loved, that he would love her until his own last breath and beyond, if such things were possible. And when grey dawn light began to seep through the curtains, and he heard the household stirring to face another day, he remained exactly where he was, holding her hand, whispering his belated declarations to her fever-flushed face, and understood that he had finally found the courage to be vulnerable, but feared desperately that he had found it too late. The second day brought no relief, only a deepening of the fever that turned Beatrice's skin to fire and her consciousness to fragments, and Edmund remained at her bedside through every moment, his vigil unbroken, despite the household's worried attempts to bring him food. He wouldn't eat, or suggest rest he wouldn't take, and as the hours bled into the third day, he watched her slip further from him into delirium, her eyes opening sometimes, but seeing nothing of the room or the man who held her hand with desperate tenderness, and it was in these fevered states, when the barriers between thought and speech dissolved entirely, that she began to speak truths she had guarded carefully in health, murmuring through cracked lips about the library evenings that had become the center of her existence, about watching him read by lamplight and feeling her heart crack open with longing she had no right to feel, about the moment she realized she loved him Christmas night, she whispered, when he gave her his mother's pearls with shaking hands, and Edmund listened with tears streaming down his face as his wife, lost to fever, confessed that she had fallen in love with a man who seemed determined to keep her at arm's length, that she was grateful for every small kindness he had shown her, even as she ached for more, that if she had just a little more time, she would have found the courage to tell him, to ask him if perhaps he might someday care for her, even a fraction of how she had come to care for him. And hearing these words that she would never have spoken in consciousness broke something fundamental in Edmund's chest, shattered the last of his carefully maintained composure, and he leaned close to her burning face and whispered back his own confessions, told her fevered, unhearing form that he had loved her since Christmas too, perhaps even before, that he had been watching her just as she had watched him, that every moment in the library had been torture and paradise combined, because he wanted so desperately to reach for her and was so deeply afraid of what it would mean to want something that much, and he told her that he had been a fool and a coward, that he had wasted months they could have spent in happiness because he was too afraid of being hurt again, too damaged by old wounds to recognize the gift she represented, and he begged her forgiveness for his coldness, for the distance he had maintained, for the almost kiss he had fled from like a coward, and he promised that if she would only survive this, if she would only come back to him, He would spend the rest of his life making up for the tenderness he had withheld, would tell her every day that he loved her, would never again let fear keep him from showing his heart. The third day wore into evening, and the household staff left food outside the door that went untouched, and Edmund's valet knocked softly and begged his master to rest for just an hour and to take some brandy, and perhaps change his clothes. But Edmund sent him away with a hoarse voice that allowed no argument, because the thought of leaving her, even for a moment, even to attend to his own deteriorating condition, was unbearable, and he continued his whispered confessions and his desperate ministrations, cooling her fever-bright skin with damp cloths, and holding water to her lips, and praying in broken fragments to a God he had stopped believing in years ago. And in the deep hours of the third night, when the house fell silent around them, and only the crackling fire witnessed his vigil, Beatrice's eyes opened with a moment of clarity, and she looked directly at him and whispered his name, and he nearly sobbed with relief and leaned closer and said, "I'm here, I'm here, I won't leave you," and she said with effort that made each word clearly painful, "You should go, you'll fall ill," and he said fiercely, "I don't care, do you understand me? I don't care about anything except you." And she smiled faintly, perhaps thinking it was only fever kindness, only the concern any decent man would show, and then the clarity faded, and she slipped back into delirium, back into the fire that was consuming her from within, and Edmund held her closer and understood with terrible certainty that he was watching the love of his life slip away, that he had finally found the courage to feel everything only to face losing everything, and the cruelty of that timing, the bitter irony of finding love in an arranged marriage only to have death threaten to claim it before it could truly begin, filled him with a rage and grief that had nowhere to go except into his continued vigil, his refusal to surrender, his whispered insistence that she stay with him, that she fight, that she not leave him alone in a world that would be unbearable without her light. The fourth day dawned grey and cold, and the doctor returned at Edmund's valet's urgent summons to find the Viscount still at his post beside the sickbed, though now he looked nearly as ill as his wife, his face haggard and unshaven, his eyes fever-bright with exhaustion and possibly contagion, and the doctor examined Beatrice with practiced hands, while Edmund watched with desperate intensity, and when the physician straightened and met Edmund's gaze, the grim determination there spoke volumes before any words were uttered, and the doctor said quietly that he had seen this pattern many times in recent weeks, that the fever typically peaked on the fifth day, and that most who reached that crisis did not survive it, that Edmund should prepare himself for the likelihood that the Viscountess would not see another week, and Edmund heard these words as though from a great distance, as though they were being spoken in some foreign tongue that his mind refused to translate into meaning. And he said with a calmness that was more terrifying than rage, "She will survive." And the doctor began to speak of acceptance and God's will and the limits of medical science. But Edmund simply turned back to Beatrice and dismissed the man with a gesture that brooked no argument, and when they were alone again, he looked at his wife's fevered face and understood with absolute clarity that he had arrived at a threshold where will and love and desperation were all he had left to offer against the advancing shadow and of death. Through the fourth day and into the night, Edmund felt his own body beginning to fail, felt the familiar ache in his bones and the heat behind his eyes that signaled the fever taking root in his own blood, and he knew distantly that he should leave her now, should save himself while there was still time, should preserve at least one life from this tragedy. But the thought was absurd, impossible, because what life would that be without her in it? What purpose would his continued existence serve in a world where Beatrice had been and was no longer? And so he ignored his own deteriorating condition and focused entirely on her, on keeping her as comfortable as possible, on speaking to her constantly in case some part of her consciousness could still hear him. And as the fifth day arrived with its pale dawn light, and she seemed to slip even further from him, her breathing growing shallow and labored, her skin burning despite all his efforts to cool it, Edmund made a decision born of desperation and devotion in equal measure, and he removed his boots and climbed carefully into the bed beside her, gathering her fever-racked body against his chest and wrapping his arms around her as though he could physically hold her to this world, as though his embrace could be an anchor strong enough to keep her from drifting into the darkness that seemed to be pulling at her with every passing hour. He held her like that through the entirety of the fifth day, speaking to her in a constant low murmur, telling her about the life they would have when she recovered, and the library evenings, and the children they might have, and the years and years they would spend together. And he prayed for the first time since his mother's death, prayed with a fervor that surprised him, because he had thought that capacity for faith had died in him long ago, and he bargained with God and fate, and any power that might be listening, offering anything, everything, in his own life if necessary. If only she would be spared. And when night fell again and she grew worse still, her breathing becoming ragged, and her body so hot it seemed impossible that she could survive such heat, Edmund pressed his lips to her temple and whispered over and over like an incantation, "Stay with me, please. I love you. Stay." And he refused to acknowledge the tears streaming down his face, or the trembling in his own fevered body, or the terrified certainty growing in his heart that love might not be enough, that wanting something desperately did not guarantee its granting. And still he held her through the dark hours when the house fell silent around them, and death seemed to hover in the very air of the room, held her with every ounce of strength remaining in his failing body, held her as though letting go even for a moment would mean losing her forever. The sixth day arrived with a grey dawn that crept through the curtains like a tentative promise, and Edmund lay beside Beatrice, still holding her against his chest, though he himself had long since slipped into a state that was neither sleep nor waking, but rather a fevered half-consciousness, where the boundaries of the world had become uncertain, and it was in this liminal state that he first noticed the change, the subtle shift in the quality of heat radiating from her body, no longer the scorching fire that had burned through 5 endless days, but something gentler, something that felt almost like normal warmth rather than the consuming blaze of fever. And he was afraid to believe it, afraid that hope itself might be a cruelty. But his hand moved to her forehead with trembling fingers and found her skin cooler, unmistakably cooler, and a sound escaped his throat that was half sob and half prayer. The morning hours passed with agonizing slowness as Edmund watched for any sign of relapse, any return of the fever that had nearly claimed her. But by midday, when weak sunlight finally broke through the grey clouds outside the window, Beatrice's temperature had dropped further still. Her breathing had eased from labored gasps to something approaching normal rhythm, and Edmund felt tears streaming down his face, though he made no sound, merely held her and shook with relief. He was too exhausted to properly express. And as afternoon shadows began their slow creep across the floor, her eyelids fluttered in a way that seemed different from the unconscious movements of delirium, and then they opened fully, and her gaze, though weak and confused, was clear, truly clear for the first time in 6 days, and she looked up at the haggard face of the man holding her and whispered in a voice like dry leaves, "Edmund?" That single word, his name spoken with recognition and awareness, broke something fundamental in Edmund's carefully maintained control. And this man who had been raised to show no weakness, who had built walls of ice around his heart after being betrayed, who had married Beatrice specifically to avoid feeling anything too deeply, found himself sobbing openly against her hair, his whole body shaking with the force of emotions too large to contain, and he managed to say through his tears, you stayed with me, and Beatrice, weak as she was, and confused by finding herself in her husband's desperate embrace, in a way their arrangement had never included, understood somehow that something profound had shifted during the days she couldn't remember, and she raised one trembling hand to touch his face and said with effort that cost her dearly, "I couldn't leave you." And Edmund pulled back just enough to look at her, his eyes red-rimmed and wild, his face unshaven and haggard, and his whole appearance that of a man who had walked through hell and barely survived, and he said with raw honesty that he could never have managed in health. "And I couldn't let you go. I love you. God help me, Beatrice, I love you. I have loved you for months, and I nearly lost you before I found the courage to tell you." And Beatrice stared at him as these words she had dreamed of but never expected to hear, washed over her fevered, exhausted consciousness, and she saw in his desperate face and trembling hands, and the way he held her as though she might disappear if he loosened his grip even slightly, that he meant it. That this was not fever kindness or duty, but real love, hard won and nearly lost, and all the more precious for how close it had come to remaining forever unspoken. The week that followed moved with the strange quality of a dream. Time measured not in hours or days, but in spoonfuls of broth accepted, in moments of wakefulness that grew gradually longer, in the slow return of colour to Beatrice's pale cheeks, and through it all, Edmund remained at her side, with a devotion that would have seemed impossible to anyone who had known him during those first cold months of their marriage, and the pretense that had governed their relationship for so long had been burned away entirely by the fever's fire, leaving only truth between them, raw and vulnerable and infinitely precious. He told her everything during those slow recovery days, repeating the confessions he had whispered while she lay unconscious, and she listened with wonder as he described holding her through the dark hours, refusing to let death claim her, praying with a fervor he thought he'd lost forever, and she wept as he spoke of his terror at nearly losing her before they'd truly begun, and she told him in return of her own hidden feelings, admitting that she had loved him for months but had been too afraid of rejection to speak, and too convinced that he could never return the affection of a woman he'd married merely for convenience, and they spoke of all the wasted time, the months of careful distance and unspoken longing, the fear and pride that had kept them apart, and Edmund said with profound regret that he had been a coward and a fool, that he had nearly let his past wounds destroy his future happiness, and Beatrice touched his haggard face and told him that they had found their way to truth in the end, that perhaps they had needed that slow accumulation of small moments to build a foundation strong enough to support the weight of real love. Edmund's tenderness during her recovery revealed dimensions of his character that Beatrice had only glimpsed in their library evenings, and he fed her broth with patient hands when she was too weak to hold the spoon herself, and he read to her for hours in his deep, steady voice when she was tired of sleeping but not yet strong enough to leave the bed, and he simply sat beside her, holding her hand when neither words nor activity seemed necessary, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm as though reassuring himself that she was real and alive and his, and the household staff who had worried over their master's cold isolation for so many years now watched with undisguised joy as he smiled at his wife with open adoration, as he laughed at something she said, as he demonstrated in 1,000 small ways that the frozen grief that had encased his heart had finally thawed. Beatrice found her own transformation in those recovery days, understanding that she had not merely survived an illness, but had been reborn into a life she had stopped believing possible, and she had found not just love but belonging, not just a husband but a partner who saw her fully and cherished what he saw, and she had found a home in this manner that had seemed so cold when she first arrived, but now felt warm with possibility, and as her strength returned and she was able to sit up in bed, and eventually to stand with Edmund's careful support, she looked at this man who had refused to leave her side, even when doing so might have saved his own life, and she understood with absolute clarity that she would spend the rest of her days grateful for the fever that had forced them both to speak the truth they had been too afraid to acknowledge in health. 2 weeks after her fever had broken, Beatrice was finally well enough to leave the confines of her chamber, and though she was still weak and needed Edmund's steady arm to navigate the stairs, she had insisted that morning that she wanted to feel sunlight on her face and breathe air that did not smell of sickroom and medicine, and so Edmund had wrapped her in blankets, despite the early spring afternoon, being milder than recent days had been, and had carried her to the garden bench beneath the old oak tree, where the first brave crocuses were pushing through the last patches of melting snow in defiant purple and white clusters that spoke of survival and renewal, and he sat beside her close enough that their bodies touched from shoulder to knee, and she noticed with tender amusement that he could not stop touching her, his hand finding hers and holding it as though it were something precious, his other hand occasionally reaching to adjust her blankets or brush a strand of hair from her face or simply rest on her shoulder, as if confirming through touch that she was real and solid and alive beside him, and not a fever dream that might dissipate if he ceased his vigilance even for a moment. They talked in the gentle way of two people who had already shared their deepest truths during crisis, and now needed to discover how to speak of ordinary things, of future things, of the life that stretched before them, no longer as strangers bound by contract, but as partners who had chosen each other through fire. And Edmund spoke with hesitant hope about his vision for their marriage going forward, about how he wanted not the hollow arrangement they had settled for, but a true partnership built on the love they had discovered. And Beatrice looked at him with eyes that held both affection and gentle humor and said, "We are already married, Edmund," and he smiled at that, a real smile that transformed his face from handsome to beautiful, And he said with the formal courtliness that was so characteristic of him even now, "Then let me court my own wife. Let me do this properly as I should have done from the beginning. Let me earn what I was given without deserving it." And Beatrice felt her heart swell with love for this man, who had been so cold and was now so warm, who had built such high walls and had torn them down stone by stone, who had held her through 6 days of fever with a devotion that had literally saved her life. And she reached up with her free hand to touch his face, feeling the rasp of stubble he had only just begun to attend to again after weeks of neglect. And she said softly, "You have already won my heart. You won it months ago, in the library, though neither of us had courage to speak it." And Edmund turned his head to press a kiss against her palm, a gesture so tender it brought tears to her eyes, and then he shifted on the bench to face her more fully, his hand coming up to cup her cheek with a gentleness that belied his size and strength. And he said with his voice low and rough with emotion, "Then let me seal this courtship properly, and there in the spring garden, with crocuses blooming around them in brave defiance of winter's lingering cold, with sunlight breaking through clouds that had been grey for so many months, with the manor standing behind them, no longer cold but full of possibility," Edmund leaned forward and kissed his wife for the first time, and it was gentle as though she were made of spun glass that might shatter, reverent as though she were something holy. He had been granted by grace he did not deserve, and full of promise for all the years that stretched ahead of them, and Beatrice kissed him back with all the love she had kept locked away during their months of careful distance, and when they finally drew apart, both had tears on their cheeks and smiles on their lips, and Edmund rested his forehead against hers and whispered, "I love you. I will love you until my last breath and beyond." And Beatrice whispered back, "And I love you, my stubborn, foolish, wonderful husband who would not let me go." And they sat together in the garden as afternoon lengthened toward evening, wrapped in blankets and in each other, speaking softly of dreams and plans and the beautiful ordinary future that awaited them, and neither noticed when the last patch of snow finally melted away completely, leaving only the green promise of spring behind. The months that followed moved with the gentle inevitability of seasons turning, spring melting into the golden warmth of summer, and the transformation that overtook both the Viscount and Viscountess Hartwell became the subject of considerable speculation and discussion throughout the county. For those who had known Edmund during his years of cold isolation could scarcely reconcile that remote figure with the man who now walked the gardens of Hartwell Manor with his wife's hand clasped firmly in his, who smiled at her across rooms with an openness that would have been unthinkable during those first frozen months of their marriage, who demonstrated in countless small public gestures the profound private devotion that had taken root during crisis and now bloomed without restraint or shame. They were inseparable in ways that made the older matrons cluck their tongues with amused disapproval, while secretly feeling moved by such evidence that love could indeed flourish even in the most unlikely soil, and the household staff who had witnessed the entire arc of their relationship, from cold arrangement through devastating illness to this present happiness, took particular pride in their master and mistress, noting how the Viscount's face had lost the lines of tension that had marked it for so many years, how he smiled now with genuine warmth rather than polite duty, how he laughed at something his wife said with his head thrown back in unguarded joy, expressions they had thought his features incapable of forming. Beatrice bloomed like the gardens she tended, her confidence growing alongside her happiness, and she moved through the manor and estate with the assurance of a woman who knew herself deeply loved and valued, and she worked alongside Edmund in ways that made them true partners rather than merely husband and wife, consulting with him on estate matters and tenant concerns, hosting gatherings that brought warmth and life back to rooms that had been shuttered and cold for too many years. And in private, their love deepened with each passing day, acquiring layers and dimensions that only time and intimacy could create. On warm summer evenings they would retreat to the library that had been the birthplace of their tentative friendship, and Edmund would pull her close on the settee they now shared, rather than occupying separate chairs, and he would whisper against her hair that he had fallen in love with her during those quiet evenings when they read in companionable silence, that he had been terrified by the strength of his feelings and had tried desperately to maintain the emotional distance their arrangement had promised, but had failed utterly because she had broken through every defense he had built, and Beatrice would turn in his arms to kiss him softly and confessed that she had loved him from the moment he gave her his mother's pearls at Christmas, that she had seen in that gesture the heart he tried so hard to hide, that she had spent months afterward aching with love. She dared not speak for fear of rejection, and they would hold each other in the lamplight and marvel at how much time they had wasted in fear and pride, how close they had come to never discovering this happiness. And they would remember, with gratitude touched by lingering terror, those 6 days when fever nearly stole their future before it had truly begun, when Edmund's refusal to let her go had quite literally saved her life. And these memories made every ordinary moment precious, every touch sacred, every day together a gift they would never take for granted. Autumn returned to Hartwell Manor with its familiar palette of gold and crimson exactly 1 year after that grey morning, when Beatrice and Edmund had spoken vows in a ceremony devoid of love or hope, and the anniversary of their wedding passed quietly with private acknowledgement between them of how far they had travelled from that cold beginning. And it was only 3 weeks after that anniversary that Beatrice began to suspect the truth. Her body was telling her, through subtle signs that became gradually impossible to ignore, and when the doctor confirmed what she had already known in her heart, she found herself standing alone in the library, with her hand pressed against her still flat stomach and tears streaming down her face, tears of joy and wonder, and a love so fierce it frightened her. And when Edmund returned from the fields that afternoon, she was waiting for him in that same library where so much of their story had unfolded, and he knew immediately upon seeing her face that something of profound significance had occurred, and she took his hands in hers and said simply, "We are going to have a child," and watched as the news transformed his expression from concern to disbelief to a joy so profound and so terrified that she understood instantly that his happiness was inseparable from his fear, that having so nearly lost her once, he now lived with the constant awareness of how fragile life was, how quickly joy could be stolen, and she watched him struggle to find words as emotions too large for language moved across his face, and finally he pulled her against his chest and held her with a tenderness that acknowledged her precious fragility, while his voice, rough with feeling, said, "I am terrified." And she held him back and said, "I know, so am I. But we will face this together as we face everything now." And they stood that way for a long while in the library that had witnessed the tentative beginning of their love, surrounded by the books his mother had collected and Beatrice had restored. And when they finally drew apart, Edmund placed his hand gently against her stomach, with such reverence that fresh tears spilled from her eyes. And in the weeks that followed, as her body began to change and their child grew within her, Edmund's fear gradually transformed into fierce protective devotion, and they would sit together in the evenings, planning and dreaming aloud, discussing names with careful consideration, imagining the child who would arrive with the spring. And one night, as firelight played across the library walls, Beatrice said softly, "We have come so far from what we were." And Edmund pulled her closer against his side and replied, "We nearly lost everything before we even began. I think of those first months and can barely recognize the man I was, so cold, so determined to feel nothing." And Beatrice turned to look up at him and said, "But you did feel. You felt so much you frightened yourself. I think perhaps we were both falling in love during those silent evenings, and neither of us had courage to acknowledge it." And Edmund kissed her forehead and said, "Our child will never know such coldness, will never doubt for a moment that they are loved beyond measure. They will be raised in warmth and laughter and the certainty of being wanted." And Beatrice felt her heart swell with gratitude for this man who had been given to her through arrangement and obligation, and had become through patience and crisis and choice the greatest love of her life. And she placed her hand over his where it rested on her stomach and said, "They will know love because they will see it every day in how we love each other." And Edmund's response was to hold her closer still, as autumn darkness gathered outside the windows and the fire burned low, and neither spoke again for a long while, content simply to sit together in the library where their story had truly begun, planning a future that had once seemed impossible and now stretched before them full of promise and hope, and the ordinary, extraordinary miracle of life continuing forward into new generations. 5 years had passed since that cold autumn morning when Edmund and Beatrice had spoken vows in a ceremony empty of love, and the transformation that time had wrought upon Hartwell Manor was so complete that visitors who had known the estate during its years of cold isolation could scarcely believe they walked through the same rooms, For where there had once been silence and shadows, there was now laughter that echoed through hallways, the sound of small feet racing across polished floors, the bright voices of children who had never known a moment without warmth and devotion. And on a golden afternoon in late September, Edmund and Beatrice stood together on the terrace overlooking the gardens, watching their 3 children at play. The eldest, a daughter of 4 with her mother's dark hair and her father's grey eyes, who commanded her younger brothers with gentle authority as they chased each other between the rose beds that Beatrice had planted during her first summer of true happiness. And Edmund stood with his arm around his wife's waist in a gesture so natural and constant that neither of them noticed it anymore, though visitors invariably remarked upon it, commenting with barely concealed wonder that they had never in all their lives seen a couple so openly devoted, so clearly and completely in love. And it was true that Edmund still reached for Beatrice's hand a dozen times each day, as if needing the constant reassurance of her physical presence, that his eyes followed her across rooms with an attention that had not diminished but rather deepened with the years, that he touched her constantly, in small ways that spoke of tenderness and need, and a love that had become the very foundation of his existence. And Beatrice returned his devotion with equal measure, her face still lighting with genuine joy each time he entered a room, her hand still seeking his in moments both significant and ordinary, her trust in him absolute and visible in every glance and gesture. The children were watched over by a nursemaid who kept a respectful distance, allowing them freedom to play while ensuring their safety. And as Edmund and Beatrice observed their daughter help her youngest brother navigate a difficult step, their eyes met with shared understanding and gratitude for these lives they had created, these small souls who would never know the cold isolation that had marked their parents' early months, who were being raised in the certain knowledge that they were wanted and loved beyond measure. And in the quiet moments when the children were abed, and Edmund and Beatrice would retreat to the library that remained their sanctuary, they would sometimes speak of those 6 days when fever had nearly stolen their future before it had properly begun. And Beatrice would say, as she had said countless times before, "You held me to this world when I would have slipped away. Your refusal to let me go quite literally saved my life." And Edmund would pull her close and reply with words that had become their private litany. "I would hold you through anything, through fever and fear and whatever trials this life brings, for the rest of my life and for all my lives. Should we be blessed with more than one, I will never let you go." And these words, spoken in lamplight with their children safe above them and the estate prosperous around them, carried the weight of absolute truth, a vow more binding than those they had spoken in that grey church 5 years past. And they would hold each other in the library, where their love had first taken root during silent evenings of barely acknowledged longing, and remember, with gratitude touched always by lingering wonder, how close they had come to missing this happiness, how a marriage begun in cold obligation and mutual protection from society's expectations had transformed through patience and crisis, and the courage to be vulnerable, into a love that astounded them both, with its depth and constancy. And Edmund would kiss his wife's forehead and think as he thought every day that he had been given more than he deserved, and that this woman and these children and this life full of warmth and laughter was a gift beyond price. And Beatrice would rest her head against her husband's shoulder and feel the same profound gratitude for a future that had once seemed impossible and now stretched before them, rich with promise and joy. Dear listener, you who have traveled alongside Edmund and Beatrice through cold beginnings and fevered crisis to this place of lasting joy, perhaps you recognize in their story something universal and true about the nature of love and transformation. For theirs is not merely a tale of 2 people who found happiness against the odds, but rather a meditation on how often we construct elaborate defenses against the very thing we most need, how we mistake protection for strength and isolation for safety, and how sometimes it requires the stark confrontation with loss to teach us that vulnerability is not weakness, but rather the only path to genuine connection. Edmund married Beatrice to silence gossip and satisfy obligation. She accepted him to escape scandal and secure her future, and both believed they could maintain the careful distance that would protect their wounded hearts from further damage. Yet what they discovered during those months of silent companionship in the library was that the human heart cannot be commanded to remain closed, that love grows in the smallest gestures and the quietest moments, That presence and attention and the gradual lowering of walls create intimacy, whether we intend it or not. And when fever came and threatened to steal away what Edmund had only just begun to acknowledge he wanted, his response was instinctive and absolute. He could not let her go, and in those 6 days of vigil, he spoke aloud what fear had kept locked within him. He declared his love to a woman who might not survive to hear it, and that act of desperate honesty became the foundation of everything that followed. There is wisdom in their story for all of us who have built walls, who have chosen safety over risk, who have convinced ourselves that we can live half-lived lives and call it prudence. For the truth is that we are not promised endless time. We are not guaranteed another chance to speak what remains unspoken or to reach for what we have denied ourselves out of fear. Edmund and Beatrice wasted months in cold silence, both loving and both afraid, and they were given the gift of crisis that forced honesty. But you need not wait for fever or disaster to show your heart, to speak your truth, to acknowledge the love that grows despite your best efforts to prevent it. Look around you at the connections you have denied, the walls you have built, the ways you protect yourself at the cost of genuine intimacy, and ask yourself whether the safety you have purchased is worth the price of isolation, whether the life you are living is the one you truly want, or merely the one you have settled for because wanting more seems too dangerous. Love in its truest form requires courage. It demands that we risk rejection and pain and loss, but it offers in return something that nothing else can provide: the profound comfort of being fully known and fully loved, of sharing your life with another soul who sees you completely and chooses you anyway, of building together something larger and more beautiful than either of you could create alone. May you find the courage to lower your walls before crisis forces them down. May you speak your truth while there is still time. May you reach for love even when fear counsels retreat. And may you discover, as Edmund and Beatrice discovered, that what begins in obligation or convenience or protection can transform into something transcendent if you allow it room to grow. This has been a Schmoody production, and if this story has touched something within you, if you recognize yourself in these characters or find hope in their transformation, please consider subscribing to this channel where we explore love in all its complexity and celebrate the courage it takes to open your heart despite the risks. May you rest peacefully tonight with hope in your heart. May you wake tomorrow with renewed courage to reach for the love you deserve. And may you remember always that it is never too late to choose vulnerability over protection, connection over isolation, and love over fear.